The most explosive moment in the NFL this week didn't happen between the lines. It happened in the conversation surrounding the game. And once it surfaced, there was no walking it back. What started as commentary quickly turned into a cultural flashpoint that exposed how deeply uncomfortable parts of football media still are with confidence, visibility, and who's allowed to lead without permission. It all traces back to Deion Sanders and his son, Shedeur Sanders, two figures who have never tried to blend in quietly. Their approach has always been direct, unapologetic, and highly visible. And for some voices in sports media, that visibility has become the problem. When a graphic comparing the Sanders family to Public Enemy imagery began circulating, it instantly set off alarms. Prison bars, crosshairs, symbolism that went far beyond football analysis. Fans didn't just see criticism, they saw a message. And that message felt less about quarterback development and more about fear of influence. That's when Shaun stepped in. King didn't respond with outrage or theatrics. He responded with experience. As someone who played quarterback at the highest level, he recognized what was really happening. This wasn't about stats or schemes. It was about who gets labeled confident and who gets labeled a problem for doing the same exact things. The moment hit a nerve because it wasn't new. Fans have watched this pattern repeat for decades. Swagger praised in one quarterback becomes a character concern in another. Visibility celebrated in some becomes distraction in others. And the line always seems to move depending on who's standing at quarterback. What made this confrontation different is that it dragged those unspoken rules into the open. No coded language, no hiding behind analytics, just a raw discussion about power, perception, and who gets to define leadership in the modern NFL. This wasn't a viral clip because it was dramatic. It was viral because it felt overdue. And once this conversation started, it was never going to stay contained to one image, one take, or one player, because it speaks to something much bigger the league can't ignore anymore. It didn't start with a hot take or a breakdown on game film. It started with an image. And once that image hit the timeline, the conversation was never going to stay about football. A graphic shared by Whitlock comparing Deion Sanders and Shedeur Sanders to Public Enemy imagery instantly set off a wave of backlash. Prison bars, crosshairs, symbolism so loaded that people stopped arguing about intent and started talking about impact. Fans didn't see analysis, they saw messaging. Public Enemy, for context, wasn't about crime or chaos. It was about resistance, voice, and confronting systems of power. So slapping that imagery onto a Hall of Fame coach and his quarterback son felt jarring to a lot of viewers, especially when neither has done anything remotely close to what the image implied. No scandals, no legal trouble, just success, confidence, and visibility. That's why the reaction was so immediate. Social media lit up with people calling the graphic reckless and unnecessary. Others said it crossed a line from critique into provocation. To be clear, there's been no official wrongdoing alleged here. This is about perception, symbolism, and how images land in a league already sensitive to issues of race and power. And once that image circulated, it took on a life of its own. What made it worse in the eyes of many was what came next. Instead of walking it back, Whitlock doubled down. He framed the image as cultural commentary, tying it to a broader argument that hip-hop culture and quarterback leadership don't mix in the NFL. According to him, the position requires submission, structure, and silence, while hip-hop represents rebellion and individualism. That framing poured gasoline on the fire. Because suddenly, the image wasn't just controversial, it was contextual. Fans started connecting dots. Why does confidence read as leadership for some quarterbacks but as defiance for others? Why does visibility become branding in one case and distraction in another? The image became a symbol of that question, not proof, but a flashpoint. This is where the conversation shifted from football to culture. People weren't just defending the Sanders family. They were reacting to what the image represented, an old tension that never fully went away. One where certain players are allowed to be loud, expressive, and self-assured, while others are expected to tone it down just to be accepted. That's why this moment didn't fade in 24 hours. Because the image didn't just criticize Deion or Shedeur Sanders. It exposed how quickly football discourse can slide from evaluation into something much heavier. And once fans felt that shift, they wanted answers. But the image was only the spark. What happened next, and who stepped into the fire, is what turned this into a full-blown confrontation the league couldn't ignore. What shifted this from online outrage to a serious conversation was who decided to respond. Shaun didn't jump in for clicks or controversy. He stepped in because, to him, the image wasn't just provocative, it was familiar. And that familiarity came from lived experience. King didn't approach the situation as a media personality. He spoke as someone who has actually played quarterback in the NFL, navigated locker rooms, front offices, and the unspoken rules that come with the position. That credibility mattered immediately. When King spoke, he wasn't theorizing. He was explaining how things really work behind the scenes. His first point was simple but heavy. This wasn't tough love or sharp criticism. According to King, the imagery crossed into something else entirely. He described it as reckless and inflammatory, not because it offended him personally, but because of what it implied. Prison bars and crosshairs placed on Deion Sanders and Shedeur Sanders weren't neutral symbols. They carried history, whether the creator acknowledged it or not. King made it clear that this wasn't about silencing critics. Criticism comes with the job. Quarterback is the most scrutinized position in sports, but there's a difference between evaluating performance and branding people in a way that invites hostility. And in King's view, that line had been crossed. What made his response land even harder was how measured it was. He didn't rant. He didn't insult Jason Whitlock. He explained why the framing was dangerous, why attaching criminal imagery to two highly visible black figures in football feeds narratives that have nothing to do with wins, losses, or development. King also reframed the conversation away from emotion and toward intent versus impact. Even if the image was meant as commentary, its effect mattered more than its explanation. Once it hit the public, it stopped belonging to the person who posted it. It became part of a much larger cultural conversation. And that's where King's voice carried weight. Because he wasn't defending perfection. He wasn't claiming the Sanders family is above criticism. He was demanding fairness. He was pointing out that the same behavior, confidence, branding, visibility is interpreted very differently depending on who's doing it. And that double standard, he argued, has followed black quarterbacks for decades. This was the moment the debate stopped being theoretical. King didn't just react, he reframed everything. And once he did, it became impossible to pretend this was only about football takes. It was about perception, power, and who gets to define what leadership is supposed to look like. And that's why, after King stepped in, there was no de-escalating the conversation anymore. Once the backlash hit, Jason Whitlock didn't retreat. He doubled down, and that's where the conversation took an even sharper turn. Instead of focusing on the image itself, Whitlock reframed the issue around what he believes the quarterback position is supposed to represent. According to his argument, success in the NFL requires submission. Submission to coaching, submission to structure, submission to authority. And in his view, anything that signals rebellion threatens that formula. Whitlock leaned heavily into the idea that hip-hop culture and quarterback leadership are fundamentally incompatible. He positioned the league as a military-style hierarchy, where silence and compliance are prerequisites for longevity. Confidence, individuality, and public self-belief were framed not as leadership traits, but as warning signs. And once that framework was set, it became clear who the argument was really aimed at. He cited statistics to support his stance, pointing out that a majority of winning quarterbacks in the league are white, suggesting that this pattern reflects who is more willing to submit to the system. He even singled out Shedeur Sanders, claiming that reports from pre-draft meetings showed resistance to coaching authority. It's important to note that these claims are opinion-based interpretations, not verified facts, but once stated publicly, they carried weight in the discourse. That's what made the argument so volatile. Because it wasn't just about football mechanics anymore. It was about behavior, tone, culture. Whitlock wasn't criticizing footwork or reads. He was questioning whether certain quarterbacks deserve trust before they've earned silence. And for many viewers, that framing felt dangerously familiar. The issue wasn't discipline. Every quarterback needs discipline. The issue was how submission was being defined and who was expected to demonstrate it. Whitlock's logic implied that visibility itself was a problem. That confidence must be muted. That personality should be hidden until permission is granted. And critics immediately asked why that standard doesn't seem to apply evenly. Because across the league, quarterbacks show emotion, celebrate loudly, build brands, and speak boldly, and are praised for it. Yet when the same traits appear in quarterbacks who don't fit the traditional mold, the language changes. Suddenly, it's about maturity, about distractions, about whether they get it. Whitlock's argument didn't spark outrage because people hate structure. It sparked outrage because it suggested structure only works one way, that the system is neutral, and it's the players who must shrink themselves to survive in it. This is where Shaun King saw the flaw, because having lived through the position himself, he knew submission has never been evenly demanded. It's been selectively enforced. And once that idea entered the conversation, the foundation of Whitlock's argument began to crack. This is where Shaun King took the conversation somewhere far more uncomfortable and far more honest. Instead of arguing stats or draft slots, King zoomed out and addressed the elephant that rarely gets named directly: visibility. Who gets to be seen? Who gets to be loud? And who gets punished for the same behavior others are praised for? King's point was blunt. Hip-hop culture isn't some fringe movement threatening football traditions. It's woven into modern American life. It's in commercials. It's on college campuses. It's on TikTok. It's playing in locker rooms across the league. Players of every background celebrate, brand themselves, dance, wear chains, and build public personas. That isn't rebellion anymore, it's the norm. But the reaction to that visibility isn't equal. King pointed out how quarterbacks across the sport display confidence without consequence. Swagger gets labeled as leadership. Emotion becomes competitive fire. Branding is framed as marketability. Yet when Shedeur Sanders carries himself with that same confidence, the language shifts. Suddenly it's about attitude, about distractions, about whether he's ready. Same actions, different interpretations. That's the double standard fans instantly recognized. King highlighted how this selective framing has followed black quarterbacks for decades. When they express individuality, it's seen as defiance. When they speak boldly, it's framed as arrogance. And when they build visibility early, it's treated as something they need to earn the right to do, even while others are celebrated for it immediately. What makes this especially clear is how inconsistent the rules feel. Some quarterbacks are allowed to grow publicly. Their mistakes are framed as learning curves. Their confidence is protected. Others are asked to shrink first, succeed quietly, and only then speak. And if they don't follow that path, the criticism turns personal fast. King wasn't arguing that every expression is perfect or above critique. He wasn't saying confidence replaces accountability. His point was about context, about how culture gets used as a shortcut explanation instead of doing real football analysis, about how hip-hop becomes a stand-in label when evaluators are uncomfortable but don't want to say why. That's why this section of the debate hits so hard. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how often confidence is coded differently depending on who displays it. How quickly leadership becomes lack of discipline when it doesn't fit a familiar mold. and how rarely those standards are applied evenly. King didn't claim this was intentional or coordinated. He framed it as systemic, something baked into how the sport learned to talk about quarterbacks decades ago. And now that the game has evolved, that old language hasn't caught up. That's the real tension. Football has changed, quarterbacks have changed, culture has changed, but the lens used to judge visibility hasn't fully adjusted. And until it does, players like Shedeur Sanders will keep being debated not just for how they play, but for how comfortable they make others feel. And that's a standard that has nothing to do with football at all. What made this confrontation resonate so deeply is that everyone knew who was really being talked about, even when his name wasn't front and center. Shedeur Sanders became the unspoken target the moment the conversation shifted from football mechanics to behavior, tone, and visibility. That's when fans stopped hearing analysis and started recognizing a pattern they've seen play out again and again. Shedeur's resume complicates the narrative critics try to pin on him. He didn't arrive quietly. He didn't wait to be validated. He stepped into programs that were struggling and helped flip expectations almost immediately. Wins followed, attention followed, and with that attention came scrutiny that often felt disconnected from what was happening on the field. Mistakes were magnified, confidence was questioned, success was routinely followed by qualifiers. That's the context Shaun King was speaking from, not theory but experience. King understood that quarterbacks are always judged, but not all quarterbacks are judged the same way. For some, confidence is treated as leadership. For others, it's treated as entitlement. And once that lens is applied, everything gets filtered through it. What's striking is how rarely Shedeur's results end the conversation. He completes tough throws. He takes hits and keeps getting up. He leads. Yet the debate often drifts away from reads and decisions and toward how he carries himself. That shift matters, because when evaluation leaves the film room and enters the personality space, it stops being purely about football. Fans have noticed how quickly labels get attached. Too confident, not submissive enough, needs to be humbled. These aren't coaching critiques, they're cultural judgments. And while none of them are official or proven claims, their repetition shapes perception. Over time, perception becomes narrative, and narrative can influence opportunity. King didn't argue that Shedeur is flawless or beyond growth. In fact, he acknowledged that declaring yourself legendary before earning it at the NFL level can create friction. That was an important distinction. The issue wasn't accountability, it was proportionality. Are the reactions matching the actions? Or are they amplified because Shedeur doesn't fit an old prototype of how a quarterback is supposed to look and sound? That's where this debate landed. Because when quarterbacks with similar confidence are praised elsewhere but questioned here, fans start asking why. And when the answers keep circling back to comfort, culture, or tone, without ever settling on football, it raises a bigger concern. Shedeur Sanders didn't force himself into this conversation. His play and presence did. And whether critics like it or not, that presence is now challenging the league to decide something important. Can a quarterback be confident, visible, and authentic and be trusted to lead? That question, more than any stat or draft slot, is what this moment put under the spotlight. This is where the conversation finally reached its most important and most misunderstood point. Shaun King wasn't arguing that Shedeur Sanders should be immune from criticism. In fact, he made the opposite clear. Accountability matters, growth matters, timing matters. Quarterback is the most demanding position in professional sports, not just physically, but politically and mentally. Every word, every reaction, every moment is magnified. But King drew a hard line between accountability and erasure. Accountability is coaching a young quarterback through mistakes, correcting habits, and helping him navigate the realities of the league. Erasure is demanding that he strip away his personality, mute his confidence, and reshape himself just to make others comfortable. And King argued that too often, black quarterbacks aren't just asked to improve, they're asked to disappear first. That distinction matters. King acknowledged that Shedeur's confidence can create friction. Calling yourself legendary before earning it at the NFL level is going to rub people the wrong way. That's reality. Coaches, veterans, and front offices care deeply about hierarchy. King didn't sugarcoat that. He explained that confidence without results can close doors instead of opening them. That's not bias, that's how the league works. But here, where erasure enters the picture. When confidence becomes the primary issue instead of development, something is off. When the conversation focuses more on tone than on reads, more on personality than on preparation, that's not accountability anymore. That's discomfort being disguised as concern. And King made it clear that this line has historically been drawn far more tightly around black quarterbacks. The league often asks them to prove humility before they're allowed to prove excellence, to earn silence before they earn trust, to fit a mold that was created long before the position evolved. That expectation doesn't show up as an official rule. It shows up in narratives, labels, and patience levels. King wasn't excusing mistakes. He was contextualizing pressure. Quarterbacks need advocates. They need people willing to stand behind them when development isn't linear. But walking into the league with an invincibility image can make that harder. King's warning wasn't about suppressing identity, it was about survival. You can be authentic and strategic. You can be confident and coachable. The two are not opposites. That's the balance King was pushing for. The danger, he argued, is when criticism stops being about improvement and starts being about conformity. When the goal shifts from help him grow to make him fit. That's when accountability quietly turns into erasure. And that's why this section of the debate mattered so much. It wasn't defending Shedeur Sanders blindly. It was demanding that the league hold quarterbacks to standards without demanding they abandon who they are to meet them. This is where the debate stopped being about one image, one commentator, or even one quarterback, and turned into something much bigger. What Shaun King ultimately forced into the open is that the National Football League is standing at a crossroads it can't keep dodging. The game has changed. The players have changed. But the way quarterbacks are judged hasn't fully caught up. The modern quarterback isn't just a pocket passer who disappears between Sundays. He's a brand, a leader, a cultural figure. He speaks directly to fans, shapes locker room identity, and carries visibility that the league itself now profits from. That evolution didn't weaken football, it expanded it. Faster offenses, more creativity, more connection. And yet, some of the standards used to evaluate quarterbacks are still stuck in an older era. That's the tension driving everything. Quarterbacks like Shedeur Sanders represent that shift clearly. He's confident, visible, comfortable being himself in public. For some, that's refreshing. For others, it's threatening not because of football, but because it challenges an outdated idea of what leadership is supposed to look like. And when discomfort shows up, it often gets disguised as concern. The league has already proven it can adapt when it has to. Mobile quarterbacks were once considered risky. Now they're essential. Expressive personalities were once discouraged. Now they sell the sport globally. Coaches adjusted. Schemes evolved. Fans embraced it. Progress happened because resistance wasn't sustainable. This moment exposed whether the same evolution is happening culturally. Are teams and media truly prepared to evaluate quarterbacks on preparation, performance, and growth, without filtering everything through comfort and conformity? Or will players still be asked to shrink themselves first, succeed quietly, and only then be allowed to lead loudly? That's the question hanging in the air. What makes this crossroads unavoidable is that the pipeline isn't changing back. College football is producing quarterbacks who are creative, outspoken, and deeply connected to culture. They're not asking permission. They're arriving as themselves. And the league can either meet them where they are or keep framing that authenticity as a problem. King's message wasn't radical, it was practical. Football doesn't need less personality, it needs better evaluation, less coded language, fewer moving goalposts, more honesty about what actually wins games and builds trust. Because if the league keeps rewarding conformity over impact, it won't stop this evolution, it'll just fall behind it. And that's why this moment mattered. Not because it solved anything, but because it made something clear. The future of quarterback play is already here. The only question left is whether the league is ready to fully accept it, or whether it will keep resisting change while benefiting from it anyway. What made this moment impossible to ignore is that it wasn't loud chaos or manufactured outrage. It was clarity, a conversation that forced uncomfortable truths into the open, not through yelling, but through exposure. What unfolded around Shaun King, Jason Whitlock, and the Sanders family wasn't just a disagreement. It was a mirror held up to how football culture still operates beneath the surface. This was never about defending Shedeur Sanders from all criticism. Growth, discipline, and accountability matter at quarterback more than anywhere else in sports. That was never in dispute. What this moment exposed is how criticism gets framed, and how quickly it drifts from football into coded judgments about culture, confidence, and comfort. When imagery replaces analysis, when personality becomes the primary talking point instead of performance, something has gone wrong. The backlash didn't come because people are overly sensitive. It came because fans recognized a familiar pattern, one where confidence is celebrated in some players and treated as a red flag in others. One where visibility is praised until it challenges expectations. Shaun King's defense landed because it wasn't emotional protection, it was contextual truth. He acknowledged reality on both sides. Yes, young quarterbacks must be strategic. Yes, branding yourself as legendary too early can create friction. But no quarterback should be forced to erase who they are just to earn patience. That's not coaching, that's conformity. This moment mattered because it dragged those contradictions into daylight. The NFL has already proven it adapts when it has to. Scheme evolution, player safety, mobile quarterbacks, media-driven branding, all of it changed once resistance became unsustainable. Culture is no different. Quarterbacks today are leaders, faces, and voices, not just play callers. Pretending otherwise doesn't protect the game, it limits it. What made this confrontation go viral wasn't outrage, it was recognition. Fans saw a system being challenged, not a person being attacked. They saw long-standing double standards named without theatrics. And once that happens, you can't unsee it. This isn't about picking sides. It's about demanding better evaluation. Less coded language, fewer moving goalposts, more honesty about what leadership actually looks like in a modern locker room. Because the future of football isn't quiet, it isn't invisible, and it isn't asking for permission. The only real question left is whether the people shaping the narrative are ready to evolve with the game, or whether moments like this will keep forcing the conversation for them.